My name is Leo, and for the better part of a year, my dream was to work at the Northwood Museum of Natural History. It wasn't like the big ones in New York or DC, but for a paleontology grad student like me, it was a goldmine. It had a legacy, a reputation for housing some really unique regional fossils. So when I landed a paid internship there, I felt like I'd won the lottery. My job, however, turned out to be less about majestic dinosaur skeletons and more about dust and forgotten things. My supervisor was the museum's head curator, Dr. Julian Albright. He was one of those academics who seemed to be permanently preserved in tweed and the faint scent of old paper. He was probably in his late 60s, with a deliberate, whispery way of talking and eyes that seemed to hold a century's worth of secrets behind thick glasses. On my first day, he didn't take me to the main labs. Instead, he led me down a series of hallways, through a door marked staff only, and then to another, heavier door that required an old-fashioned skeleton key. Your project, Mr. Jennings, he said, his voice echoing in the concrete stairwell, is one of great importance, though it lacks a certain glamour. He led me down and down into the museum's sub-basement. The air grew cold, heavy with the smell of damp earth and formaldehyde. He stopped in front of a massive, hermetically sealed door, the kind you'd see on a bank vault. He spun a heavy wheel lock, and the door hissed open. This, he announced with a sweep of his hand, is the catacomb. That's what the staff called it, anyway. It was a climate-controlled, windowless room, maybe 50 by 50 feet, packed to the ceiling with old wooden crates and metal shelving units. This is our dead collection, over 100 years of acquisitions. Animal bones, taxidermy, geological samples. Things that were improperly labeled, or deemed redundant, or simply forgotten. Your job is to go through everything, crate by crate, bone by bone. Identify it, catalog it, and digitize the records. It's a lonely task, but a necessary one. He paused, his gaze lingering on the oppressive rows of shelves. A word of warning. The space can be unsettling. This foundation is part of the original 1888 structure. The museum's founder, Alistair Finch, was a brilliant man, but eccentric. There are strange rumors about the work he did down here. Pay them no mind. It's just an old building making old building noises. He gave me a thin smile, handed me an access card and the key, and left me there. The heavy vault door sealed shut behind him, and the silence that fell was absolute. It was just me, the hum of the climate control, and 100 years of dead things. The first week was tedious, but kind of exciting. I felt like a treasure hunter. I'd pry open a crate and find a box of unlabeled bird skulls, or the fossilized femur of a dire wolf. It was a mess, but it was my mess. I set up a small workstation with a laptop and a digital camera. The only sounds were the creak of crate lids, the clink of bones on my metal table, and the tap of my keyboard. But Dr. Albright was right. The place was unsettling. The uniform shelving created endless, identical aisles. And sometimes, when I was deep in a row, I'd get this prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I'd spin around, but there was never anything there but shadows. The first truly weird thing I found was about 2 weeks in. I was sorting through a crate labeled Swede specimens, 1910 to 1920. Pig bones, basically. But at the bottom of the crate, I found a pig's tibia that had been sawed cleanly in half. Not with a butcher's saw, but with something finer, more precise, like a surgical tool. It was odd, but I chalked it up to some old, forgotten experiment and logged it as an anomaly. A few days later, in a box of deer antlers, I found a single human molar. I felt a jolt of ice in my stomach. I told myself it was probably from a medical school skeleton, something that got mixed in by mistake decades ago. I put it in a separate evidence bag and tried to forget about it, but the anomalies kept coming, and they grew harder to ignore. I found a collection of coyote skulls, one of which had a small round hole in the back of it, perfectly consistent with a small caliber bullet. In a crate of fossilized clams, I found a tarnished silver locket containing a faded photograph of a woman I didn't recognize. I was cataloging a history of decay, but I was starting to feel like a detective at a cold case. The feeling of being watched intensified. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like a faint scraping noise from the far end of the room, but whenever I went to investigate, it would stop. The hum of the climate control seemed to be whispering to me that the breaking point came a month into the project. I was in the very back of the room, wrestling with a heavy, unmarked crate that had been wedged behind a metal cabinet. When I finally pried the lid off, the smell that hit me was wrong. It wasn't the dry, dusty scent of old bones. It was the faint, coppery smell of old blood. Inside, nestled among packing straw, was the fully articulated skeleton of a dog. But intertwined with its rib cage was a human hand. The bones were yellowed with age, and a small, gold ring was still circling the ring finger. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a mixed-up specimen. This was a body. A piece of one, anyway. My mind was racing. Who was this? How did they get here? The rumors about the founder, Alistair Finch. What if they weren't just rumors? My eyes darted around the dark, oppressive room, and I felt a surge of pure panic. I had to tell someone. I had to tell Dr. Albright. I was about to pack up my things when my hand brushed against the wall behind the cabinet. It wasn't concrete. It was wood paneling, disguised to look like the rest of the wall. My curiosity, a stupid, morbid curiosity, overrode my fear. I pushed on the panel, and it swung inward with a low groan, revealing a small, dark compartment. Inside, covered in a thick layer of dust, was a small wooden box. And inside that box, nestled in velvet lining, were about a dozen wax cylinders, the kind used in early phonographs. A small brass plaque on the inside of the lid read, AF, a private catalog.my. Blood ran cold. AF Alistair Finch. I carefully took one of the cylinders back to my workstation. The museum had an old, hand-cranked phonograph in its archives for presentations. The next morning, feigning a research question, I checked it out. Back in the tomb-like silence of the catacomb, I slid the first cylinder onto the machine. I placed the needle, turned the crank, and a voice, warped by time and static, crackled to life. It was a man's voice, calm, educated, and utterly chilling. October 12, 1898, the voice began, clear as day despite the hiss. Specimen number 1, a transient male of approximately 30 years. Robust, but with little intellectual curiosity. I acquired him near the docks. The subject was uncooperative. The cause of expiration was a precise cranial trauma, administered with a geological hammer. I find his skeletal structure to be a perfect example of a life of manual labor. He will be cataloged alongside the specimens of Ursus americanus, the American black bear. It seems a fitting comparison. The brute force of nature, side by side. I snatched the needle off the cylinder, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't a scientific log. It was a confession, a murder journal. I played another cylinder. December 3rd, 1898, specimen number 2. A young woman, a flower seller. Delicate features. I was forced to dispose of her locket separately, a regrettable sentimentality. Her remains will be distributed among the Cenozoic collection, a fossil for a future age. The silver locket. It was her. I grabbed another and another. Each one was a calm, detached description of a person, a life, reduced to a specimen to be curated, to be hidden among the bones of animals. Alastair Finch wasn't just the museum's founder. He was a serial killer who had used his own museum as a personal graveyard. My mind reeled. This explained everything. The human bones, the artifacts. A century of secrets hidden right under everyone's noses. I had to get out. I had to go to the police. I frantically began packing my bag, my eyes darting towards the heavy vault door, my only way out. Then I saw the last cylinder. It was labeled differently. Just a date, May 7th, 1924. Finch had reportedly died of a heart attack in 1923. It was impossible. With a sense of dread so profound, it felt like I was swallowing glass. I placed it on the phonograph. The static was heavier on this one, the voice older, more tired, but unmistakably Finch. It has been many years, the voice rasped. My death was liberating. It allowed my work to continue, unburdened by a name that had grown too conspicuous. Alastair Finch is a ghost, a legend, but the collection must be maintained. It must be honored. I have found a protege, a clever boy from the university, so eager to please. He shares my passion for preservation. He will be the new curator. I have given him everything. My knowledge, my methods, even my mother's maiden name as his own new surname. The boy will make a find. Albright. The word hung in the silent, cold air. Albright. My blood turned to ice. A sound from behind me made me spin around. The heavy vault door, the one I had locked from the inside, was slowly, silently swinging open. Standing there, silhouetted against the light of the stairwell, was Dr. Julian Albright. He wasn't smiling. His eyes, magnified by his thick glasses, looked ancient and predatory. "Mr. Jennings," he said, his voice the same calm, whispery tone as always. "I see you found the private catalog." He took a slow step into the room, letting the vault door swing shut behind him with a final, deafening boom that sealed us both in the darkness. I must confess, I was beginning to worry you lacked the proper intellectual curiosity for the position. He took another step closer, and I could see he was holding something in his hand. A small, heavy geological hammer. "But I see now you're perfect. Absolutely perfect. We have a new specimen to add to the collection." My name is Frank, and for the last 15 years, I've been the head of night security at the Oakhaven Historical Museum. It's not a glamorous job, but it suits me. I'm a creature of habit, and there's a peacefulness to having an entire building to yourself. The quiet hum of the HVAC system, the predictable click-clack of my boots on the marble floors, the ghostly glow of the exit signs. It's my own little kingdom of silence. I've seen dozens of exhibits come and go. Civil War artifacts, antique farming equipment, local pottery. Nothing ever fazed me. They were just things. Until the wax figures arrived. The exhibit was called Faces of the Forgotten, and the museum director, a slick guy named Mr. Abernathy, was ecstatic about it. It was a loan from some private collector who had bought up the entire inventory of a defunct roadside wax museum from the 1920s. The promotional material called it a time capsule, a collection of figures depicting ordinary people from our towns past a blacksmith, a schoolteacher, a farmer and his wife, a little girl holding a doll. When the movers brought them in, I helped uncrate them. And I gotta tell you, from the second I saw them, something felt wrong. They were incredibly lifelike. Too lifelike. The craftsmanship was astounding. Every wrinkle, every stray hair, the faint blush on their cheeks. but it was their eyes. They were glass, of course, but the artist had somehow given them a wet, shimmering depth. When you walked past them, you'd swear their eyes followed you. My partner, Dave, who works the day shift, joked about it. "Don't let him bite, Frank," he'd say. I'd just laugh it off. But at night, alone, the joke wasn't funny. The silence of the museum wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt occupied. The first week, it was just little things. Things you could easily explain away. I'd start my 11 p.m. patrol, and I'd notice the blacksmith's hammer was angled slightly differently than when I'd made my last round. Or the school teacher's head, which was facing forward when I started my shift, would be tilted slightly to the left, as if she were listening for something down the hall. I told myself it was the cleaning crew from the evening, or maybe the building settling. But I knew the cleaning crew wasn't allowed in that hall once the exhibit was set up, and a building doesn't settle in a way that makes a wax figure turn its head. I started taking pictures on my phone at the beginning of each shift, just to prove to myself I wasn't going crazy. And the pictures proved I wasn't. One night, the farmer's wife, a stern-looking woman holding a basket of fake apples, had one hand on the basket's handle. The next morning, her fingers were curled around the apple on top. A small change, but it was impossible. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach every time I had to walk through that exhibit hall. I started taking the long way around through the agricultural history wing just to avoid them. The feeling of being watched became constant, a physical weight on my shoulders. Then came the whispers. I was in my security office, watching the monitors, when I heard it over the speaker for the hall's audio feed. It was a faint, breathy sound, like someone whispering right into the microphone. I turned up the volume, and I could just make out a word, cold. I bolted from the office, my heart pounding, convinced a transient had broken in. I searched the entire exhibit, every corner, every shadow. The hall was empty, except for the figures standing there, silent and still under the track lighting, their glass eyes seeming to mock me. That's when things got personal. A few nights later, I found my car keys, which I had left on the desk in my locked office, dangling from the outstretched finger of the little girl figure. She was holding them out, as if offering them to me. I just froze, staring at them. How? Who? There was no sign of forced entry into my office. Only Mr. Abernathy, and I had a master key. I snatched the keys back, and my hand brushed against the figure's waxy fingers. They were cold, but there was a strange texture to the skin, almost porous. It wasn't smooth like I expected. I was genuinely terrified now. I thought about quitting, but I'd been there 15 years. This was my life. I couldn't let some prank, or whatever this was, push me out. I decided to fight back. I had to know what was going on. I started digging into the history of the exhibit. I went to the town library and spent hours scrolling through microfilm archives, looking for any mention of the original Galloway's Wax Emporium. And that's when I found it. A series of articles from the Oak Haven Chronicle, dated 1928. The owner of the museum, a man named Silas Galloway, was a reclusive and deeply strange man. The articles spoke of his revolutionary techniques for creating his figures, techniques he kept a closely guarded secret. But the real story was darker. Over the 5 years his emporium was open, at least 8 people transients, lonely travelers, people with no local connections, had vanished without a trace in the surrounding area. Silas Galloway was a person of interest, but the police could never find any evidence. No bodies, no witnesses. He was never charged. He closed his museum abruptly in 1929 and became a recluse until his death. A cold dread washed over me as I read. I kept digging, and I found a reference to a paper Galloway had published in an obscure chemistry journal. before he opened his museum. I tracked it down through an interlibrary loan. The title was A Method for Permanent Biostatic Preservation via Paraffin Infusion. I'm not a scientist, but I read the whole thing, my hands shaking. It wasn't a manual for making wax figures. It was a grotesque, detailed recipe. A process that involved a series of chemical baths designed to force hot, liquid paraffin wax deep into the pores and tissues of a human cadaver. It would push out all the water, perfectly preserving the body internally, while encasing it in a thin, durable outer layer of wax. The process would make a corpse look, for all intents and purposes, like an incredibly lifelike wax statue. My blood ran cold. I dropped the journal on the table. It wasn't a collection of sculptures. It was a collection of bodies. The blacksmith, the schoolteacher, the little girl, they were the missing people from the articles. Silas Galloway hadn't just been a weird artist. He was a monster. A killer who turned his victims into his own private art exhibit. And now they were here, in my museum. I raced back to work that night, my mind a chaotic mess. Who knew about this? The collector? Mr. Abernathy? Were the whispers and moving objects just my mind breaking under the strain of it all? Or was something else going on? I went straight to the exhibit hall, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The figures were all there, in their places. But the farmer and his wife, they were no longer standing side by side. They were now angled toward each other, their heads tilted as if sharing a secret. I felt a surge of rage and terror. I had to know for sure. I took out my pocket knife and walked toward the blacksmith figure. My hand was trembling. I reached out and made a small, deep scratch on the back of its hand. It wasn't a solid block of wax. Beneath a thin, waxy layer was something else. Something pale and fibrous, with the distinct texture of preserved skin. I stumbled back, gagging, the horrible truth crashing down on me. I was a security guard in a mausoleum. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. The hall was silent. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness. I made it to my office and locked the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I sat down at the monitor console, my eyes glued to the camera feed from the exhibit hall. And then I saw it. Standing in the middle of the hall, perfectly still, was a figure that hadn't been there before. It was a man in a modern, expensive suit. For a second, I thought it was another one of the wax figures, one I hadn't noticed. But then, he slowly turned his head and smiled directly at the security camera. Directly at me. It was Mr. Abernathy, my boss. The museum director. As I stared, horrified, he calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old-fashioned key. He walked over to the base of the little girl figure, knelt down, and wound a mechanism I'd never seen before. A faint, tinny music box melody began to play, and the little girl's head slowly, mechanically, turned to face the camera. Abernathy stood up, gave the camera one last, chilling wink, and then walked out of the frame. And then I remembered something from the articles I'd read. A small detail I'd overlooked. Silas Galloway, the killer, had a daughter. A daughter who had inherited his estate, his collection, and his secrets. Her married name was Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy wasn't just the director who had brought the exhibit here. He was Silas Galloway's grandson. This wasn't just an exhibit to him. It was his family legacy. He hadn't just been moving the figures. He'd been playing with me. A sick, generational game, tormenting the person hired to watch over his family's collection. And I realized my job was no longer to keep people out. It was to keep the secrets in. I'm still here tonight. The exhibit has been extended indefinitely. And every time I walk the halls, I know I'm not alone. I'm being watched. by the dead and by the living. My name is Clara, and I'm an art conservator. I restore paintings. It's a quiet, meticulous job, a conversation with the past. I've worked on Rembrandts with cracked varnish and Monets that have faded in the sun. But I've never encountered anything like The Girl in the Gown. The painting was the crown jewel of the Atherton Fine Arts Museum, a small, ridiculously wealthy private institution housed in a Gilded Age mansion. The painting itself was a masterpiece, a life-sized portrait from 1895 by a brilliant but obscure artist named Alistair Crowe. The subject was a young woman named Isabel Atherton, the 19-year-old daughter of the industrialist who built the mansion. She's depicted standing in the middle of her bedroom, wearing a magnificent ball gown of iridescent silk. But the painting isn't famous for its beauty. It's famous for its tragedy. 3 weeks after Alistair Crowe put the final brushstroke on the canvas, Isabel Atherton vanished from that very room. The door was locked from the inside, the windows barred. She was just gone. The mystery was never solved. A year later, the artist, Crowe, drowned himself in the river. The painting was his last haunting legacy. The museum hired me because a fine network of cracks had started to appear across the canvas, and they wanted the best. When they unveiled the painting for me in my private studio, I was speechless. It was even more captivating in person. But as I studied it, I felt a strange, cold unease. It was her eyes. Crowe had painted her with an almost photorealistic precision, and her eyes held an expression of such profound, pleading terror that it made my skin crawl. It wasn't the look of a girl posing for a portrait. It was the look of a girl staring at her own doom. The first few weeks of the restoration were standard. I cleaned the surface, analyzed the pigments, and carefully began the process of in-painting the cracks. But the painting started to get under my skin. I would have these awful, claustrophobic nightmares. I'd dream I was trapped in a tight, dark space, the smell of plaster and damp earth filling my lungs, my own screams muffled by stone. I'd wake up gasping for air, my heart racing. I chalked it up to stress, to being too immersed in the painting's tragic story. During my work, I noticed a tiny inconsistency in the wall, behind Isabel in the portrait. The paint was just a fraction of a millimeter thicker there, the texture slightly different. It was the kind of detail only a conservator would ever notice. Professionally, I was obligated to investigate. I decided to do a full X-ray fluorescence scan, a non-invasive technique that lets us see the chemical elements in the paint layers, essentially allowing us to see if an artist painted over something. I set up the equipment one evening after the museum had closed, the big, empty mansion silent around me. As the scanner slowly moved across the canvas, I watched the images render on my monitor. Layer by layer, the computer peeled back the paint of Isabel's bedroom. And then I saw it. My breath caught in my throat. Beneath the final layer of paint, beneath the image of Isabel in her beautiful gown, Alistair Crowe had painted something else first. It was a second painting of the same room. But in this version, Isabel was gone. And on the wall where she had been standing, Crowe had painted the faint but unmistakable architectural outline of a door that my mind was spinning. There was no door on that wall in the actual Atherton mansion. Isabel's bedroom, now the museum's main gallery where the painting hung, had only one entrance. This was a secret, a clue hidden for over a century. Why would he paint a door and then paint his subject over it, hiding it completely? The pleading terror in her eyes suddenly made a new, horrible kind of sense. The next morning, I presented my findings to the museum's board of directors, a stuffy group of elderly men, all descendants of the Atherton family. I expected them to be fascinated. Instead, they looked horrified. The chairman, a man named Mr. Harrington, who was Isabel's great-grandnephew, went pale. He dismissed the other board members and asked me to stay. His hands were trembling as he clasped them on the polished table. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "what I am about to tell you has been a secret in my family for 4 generations. A secret we have protected at all costs." He took a deep breath. Isabel did not vanish. She was murdered. The air in the room grew thick and cold. Her father, my great-grandfather, was a cruel, possessive man, he continued. Isabel had fallen in love with the artist, Aleister Crowell. They were commoners, you see, and completely unsuitable. They planned to elope the night after the portrait was finished. But her father found out. In a fit of rage, he confronted her in her bedroom. There was a struggle, and he killed her. I felt sick. What happened to her? I asked. My voice shaky. Harrington couldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the wall, at a portrait of his ancestor, the murderer. The mansion had secrets, built during its construction, hidden passageways, priest holes. My great-grandfather, he took her body and sealed it inside a small, hidden chamber. Panic grew, accessible only through a secret door in her bedroom. He paused, and his eyes finally met mine, filled with a look of pure dread. He then brought Aleister Crowell back to the room. He told the artist that Isabel had run away, heartbroken, and he forced Crowell, under threat of death, to finish the portrait as a tribute. But Crowell knew. He must have suspected the truth. The pieces all clicked into place in my mind, forming a picture so monstrous I could barely comprehend it. The hidden painting, the door. It wasn't a clue. It was a map. Aleister Crowell, trapped in an impossible situation, had painted the location of his lover's tomb onto the canvas, a final desperate act of witness. But then, terrified of what Isabel's father would do, he had painted her over it, hiding the secret but leaving the plea for help in her eyes for the world to see. A message no one had understood until now. He couldn't save her, so he immortalized her terror. "So where is she?" I whispered. "Where is the wall?" Mr. Harrington looked at me, his face ashen. "You've been working in her bedroom for the past month, Miss Vance. The restoration studio. It's a temporary setup. The museum's main gallery, where the painting always hangs. That is Isabel Atherton's original bedroom." My blood turned to ice. He didn't need to say another word. I knew exactly where the wall was. It was the main, load-bearing wall of the gallery. The wall they built my temporary studio against. The wall that, for the past month, the girl in the gown had been leaning against while I worked. The project was immediately and quietly canceled, citing structural concerns with the canvas. I signed a non-disclosure agreement, thicker than a phone book. The Atherton family's secret was safe. I packed up my things that day, but before I left, I went back into the gallery one last time. I stood before the empty space on the wall where the painting had hung. I reached out and pressed my hand against the cold, floral wallpaper. It was no longer a wall to me. It was a headstone. And I knew, with a certainty that will haunt me for the rest of my life, that the girl in the gown was still in there, trapped in the dark, just like in my nightmares. She had never left her room, and after more than a century, she was still waiting. And that's all for tonight. Remember, the most terrifying monsters are the ones that look just like us, the ones who might even live right next door. If these stories serve as a good reminder to trust your instincts, then show your support and like and subscribe. Hitting that bell means you'll get a warning before the next nightmare begins. Sleep well, if you can.